අද්විතීය 200 Mbps ස්පීඩ් එකකින් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ වේගවත්ම සහ පුළුල්තම හෝම් බ්‍රෝඩ්බෑන්ඩ් සම්බන්ධතාවය වන SLT Mobitel දේශයේ ෆයිබර් බලවේගය ඔබත් අදම අත්විඳින්න.
හරිම සුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Sunday, the 16th of April 2023. Positivity. Japan International Cooperation Agency eager to resume Japanese-funded projects which were halted in Sri Lanka. What's the best? Professor of International Development Shanta Devarajan to join virtually to speak about Sri Lanka's approach in debt restructuring. Baseless. Opposition leader Sajid Premadasa refutes claims that SJB members are to cross over to the government to obtain privileges. Intervention. Amnesty International calls on the Biden administration to prevent the passing of the new Sri Lankan anti-terrorism law.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9 with Devarajan. From Studio 24 in Colombo.
Alliance Finance මෙතුරු රන්නයි සේවාවෙන් රන් පවුම්කට රුපියල් 1,70,000ක ඉහළ අධිකාරම.
ඔබේ විශ්වාසය දෙනු සෙන්සුරයින් දැන් ළඟම ඇති ෆාමසියෙන් ලබාගත හැක.
And a warm welcome. Tonight too, we take you to your top stories from across Sri Lanka and around the world. And first, your latest. The Japan International Cooperation Agency expresses eagerness to resume Japanese-funded projects in Sri Lanka immediately. JICA's Senior Vice President for South Asia made this remark to the Sri Lankan delegation in the United States attending the World Bank IMF spring meetings. The Sri Lankan delegation also met other bilateral and multilateral partners on the sidelines of the meetings.
The Sri Lankan delegation met with co-chair of the Paris Club Secretariat William Roos on the sidelines of the World Bank International Monetary Fund spring meetings in Washington. During the meeting, discussions were held on the progress made so far on debt restructuring process and the important role played by the Paris Club. In another meeting, the Sri Lankan delegation met with Deputy Vice Minister for International Affairs of Japan Kentaro Ogata, who reaffirmed Japan's priority to assist Sri Lanka in the debt negotiation process. Meanwhile, Senior Vice President for South Asia of the Japan International Cooperation Agency Imoto Sachiko, who engaged in a discussion with the Sri Lankan delegation, reiterated Japan's commitment to support Sri Lanka's economic recovery. Sachiko expressed JICA's eagerness to resume Japan-funded development projects in Sri Lanka. In the meantime, the Sri Lankan delegation held discussions with President of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, Jin Lee Quinn. Discussions focused on how Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and Sri Lanka could work closely in financing sustainable infrastructure development. In response, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank assured their support to Sri Lanka to overcome the crisis. Meanwhile, discussions held with Deputy Minister of Finance of Brazil, Tatiana Rosito, focused on Sri Lanka's progress in implementing economic reforms and debt negotiations. The Deputy Minister of Finance, in response, expressed Brazil's utmost support for Sri Lanka's rapid recovery.
Sri Lanka's rapid recovery, overcoming the debt crisis and generating non-debt creating revenue. This is the focus of discussions. And tonight on the news, we will be joined virtually live by Professor of International Development from the United States, Professor Shanta Devarajan, to talk about what Sri Lanka's approach should be going forward in terms of debt restructuring. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Devarajan. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Nice to be here.
In terms of Sri Lanka's debt restructuring process, we saw previously too that the Sri Lankan delegations, while attending the IMF World Bank spring meetings, have been talking to several multilateral and bilateral partners, and there are reassurances of overcoming the crisis, support for Sri Lanka to navigate this crisis in a more effective and stronger manner. But in your opinion, what should be our approach now once the IMF bailout package has been approved, but there needs to be more revenue generating mechanisms that should be created? So what should Sri Lanka's approach be now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's nice to see you again. Sri Lanka's approach is the first part of Sri Lanka's approach has to be the debt restructuring. See, the IMF package that was approved in March enabled Sri Lanka now to start negotiating with its creditors about a reduction in the amount of debt that is owed, which is necessary if we have any chance of being able to pay back the debt. So that's been the focus of the initial negotiations, and that's both the private creditors, the international sovereign bondholders, as well as the official creditors, such as China, Japan, and India. And there were preliminary discussions with both groups of creditors over the spring meetings just last week, which I think in all respects seem to show a willingness on the part of both sides to reach an agreement. It'll take time because these negotiations are not easy, but the focus is on being able to have a debt restructuring agreement with the creditors by September of this year. Now, in addition to that, I think, as you suggested, Sri Lanka has a very low level of revenues relative to GDP compared to other countries of comparable income. In fact, the revenue to GDP ratio fell to 8% of GDP, which is one of the lowest in the world. I think next to Somalia, it is the lowest in the world. And they've been introducing programs to increase that revenue. It used to be actually 20% of GDP, so it's possible to get the revenue to GDP up. They've increased income taxes and increased the value-added tax rates in the last few months. But I think there are other sources of revenue that are largely untapped. In particular, the large number of tax holidays that have been granted to foreign investors is a huge potential source of revenue that have been foregone. The evidence is that foreign direct investors are not attracted by tax holidays. That's not the main reason. The main reason they invest in a country is if there's macroeconomic stability in the country. So you see that these tax holidays might be working against us, but because they have contributed to the macroeconomic instability. So if we were able to introduce a uniform across-the-board tax on foreign investors that is comparable to the corporate income tax, that would be a huge source of revenue. And then I would dare say that maybe we should go back and look at the number of investors who are already here who are enjoying tax holidays, such as lots of the hotels and resorts and so on, and renegotiate those agreements. But it's true that we have signed an agreement to give them a tax-free status, but I think given the current situation in the country, where the country desperately needs revenue, and various people in the country are having to pay more for revenue through higher taxes and so on, I don't see why we couldn't also try to get these foreign investors to pay some of the taxes. These people are not poor, they're actually quite rich, and they should be able to bear some of that burden.
Right. Right. I remember you mentioning this when we spoke somewhere last year during the height of the crisis, that Sri Lanka, the state, should focus on feeding its people before settling debt. Recently, we've seen more protests against income tax rises and the government's tax policy, especially personal tax policy. So how do you think the government should tackle this? While analysts say, yes, income tax base should be widened, especially for the government to raise revenue, there's also a massive burden on the people. So what's your opinion on this?
Well, I think the recent protests in light of the tax increases, for instance, the lowering of the tax threshold from 200,000 rupees to 100,000 rupees, is an example, or it's a reflection of the fact that the people who have benefited from the tax cuts, the Rajapaksa tax cuts of 2019, were the middle and upper middle classes, because they're the ones who are now having to pay higher taxes. They're the ones whose tax rates were lowered back in 2019. Now, this to me is a good example of how the adjustment program should be implemented. Because what we're trying to do in Sri Lanka with the restructuring is to bring the country back into macroeconomic stability while protecting the poor, the lowest classes, the poor and the vulnerable. Well, if you're going to bring about macroeconomic stability while protecting the poor, it's the non-poor, it's the rich who have to pay. They're the ones who have to tighten their belts as part of the adjustment program. And that's what's happening, is that the people who have to tighten their belts, the people who have to pay higher taxes now are the ones who are protesting. But to me, that's a good sign. That's a sign that this program is working, because they're the ones we want to pay. I mean, by the way, just before this interview, I looked up the numbers. I mean, the previous income tax threshold, the level above which you have to start paying income taxes, was 200,000 rupees a month. Now, the people earning 200,000 rupees a month come from the 81st percentile of the income distribution. That means they're richer than 81% of Sri Lankans. Now, this is way too high a threshold. You want more than the richest 20% to pay taxes.
How would you analyze the more than bearable inflation and the people's how they could manage the growing and increasing prices of commodities in the country?
Absolutely, I think that's the tragedy of it, is that this austerity is having to be taking place during a period of high inflation, and that's really, really very, very damaging. But think about it. Inflation is the biggest tax on the poor, because when there's inflation, everybody pays the tax, including the poor. Now, the poor are the people whose incomes are not indexed to inflation, so they have almost no chance of protecting themselves from inflation. The only people who can are the rich, are the better off, and that's why this program has to be geared towards the non-poor. And believe me, that if you're able to increase revenues, as the government has shown that it can in the last few months, that will bring down the level of inflation, which will benefit the poor and benefit the middle classes as well. So there is this trade-off here, where we're asking people who can afford it to pay taxes in such a way that the rest of the country can actually live under less inflation.
Would you recommend a specific approach for the government in the interim while we await inflation to ease, and while the poor, the most vulnerable affected by this crisis, get some benefit, a welfare mechanism more targeted to the most vulnerable?
Absolutely. So that's the point. And you know, the other side, we talked about the tax increases, but the other side of this are the subsidy cuts, the cuts in electricity subsidies and fuel subsidies and so on, all of which, by the way, were being enjoyed by the rich, right? Something like 40% of the electricity subsidies goes to the richest 20% of the population. So when you cut that, those people are going to face a big cut. But the important thing is the important thing is that you can use that money that you save by cutting subsidies or raising taxes and use it to give cash transfers to the poor. Mm-hmm. Now, we do have a cash transfer mechanism, which is Samurdhi, which unfortunately is not very well targeted. And that's why some of my colleagues at the Verite Research Foundation have proposed that there's a more effective targeting mechanism, which is to use people's electricity bills. If you consume less than 600 kilowatts per month of electricity, then there's a very good chance that you're poor. And if you consume more than 600 kilowatts, you're not poor. Yeah. So you use the electricity bill as an indicator of whether you're eligible for these cash transfers or not. And it turns out that's a more efficient way of targeting the poor than the current Samurdhi formula.
Mm-hmm. You spoke about investor confidence earlier on, Professor Devarajan, and also how we should protect existing investors as well as new investors to the country. At the same time, our headline story, you may have seen it, we spoke about the anti-terrorism bill. There's a lot of concern across international non-governmental agencies as well as other activists, while government maintains that this is necessary for the security of the country. How would you look at this, the new law that is to be brought, especially with the Amnesty International calling the Joe Biden administration to pressure the Sri Lankan government to scrap the bill totally, and the protests ongoing? Will this have an impact on investments to Sri Lanka?
Well, I'm not a political scientist. I can't comment on the politics behind the anti-terrorism law. What I will say is that investors are concerned not just about the political instability in the country, but the economic instability. And that's what I've been helping the government try to reduce, is the economic instability. And I think the more we can do to show prudent macroeconomic management, that is lower fiscal deficits and greater tax to GDP ratios, the more confident investors will have that the Sri Lankan economy is on a path to recovery. And I know in some discussions we were having with the creditors this last week, they're all actually very, very interested in coming back to Sri Lanka, the bondholders in particular. They just want some assurance that if they do invest in Sri Lanka, that the economy will continue to improve, that there won't be this kind of disastrous economic policies of the Rajapaksa administration that were truly reckless and that ruined Sri Lanka's reputation in the international capital markets.
Right.
So,
Professor, I just have 1 minute and I have one last question. You have worked alongside the government and also consulting for and advising the government in terms of achieving a bailout package with the International Monetary Fund, which we received recently, the first tranche. But going forward, we have spoken of a creditor platform together with Japan, India and France to restructure Sri Lanka's debt. And what should Sri Lanka's approach be in terms of dealing with China and India? So with all these, there are many questions. I'd like you to give us a brief remark on restructuring debt and the way out.
Well, that's what we started with, which is that now that the IMF program has been approved, we are embarking on a debt restructuring that is based on the debt sustainability analysis that the IMF produced in collaboration with the Sri Lankan government last year. So that debt sustainability analysis tells us what is the level of debt that, if we reach it, Sri Lanka will be able to pay it back. And then we take that to each of the creditors. So we take it to China, to Japan, to India, as well as the private bondholders and say, okay, so this is the aggregate level of debt that Sri Lanka can repay. Now let's reduce your debt Sri Lanka's debt to you by an amount that is commensurate with that aggregate level of debt. So that's the conversations that are going on right now, is how much of a haircut, as they say, these countries will take of their debt in order that Sri Lanka will then be in a position to pay back what is left of the debt.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Devarajan, for your time here, joining us virtually to discuss Sri Lanka's way forward and revenue-generating mechanisms.
Thank you.
We had with us Professor Shanta Devarajan, Professor of International Development at Georgetown University and former acting chief economist of the World Bank Group, joining us to talk about Sri Lanka's approach in restructuring debt as well as revenue generation mechanisms to lure more investments to Sri Lanka. We'll be back after this short break on the other side.
ගොඩමඩ පෙරලි කරන බලපුළුවන් කාරයා මහින්ද්‍රා යුවෝ ටීමෝ වෙතින්. වැඩම ගොඩයි ගොඩම තමයි. ස්වරාජ් ට්‍රැක්ටර් ටීමෝ වෙතින්. මේ අලුත් අවුරුද්දේ හිත පිරෙන ගනුදෙනුවකට හොඳම තැන හිත ගිය තැන බැංකුව HNB.
පාරිභෝගිකයන් වෙත අසම සම ප්‍රතිලාභ හිමිකරදීම අපට අභිමානයක්. රුපියල් බිලියන 9.8ක බෝනස් නිකුතුවක්. මාසිකව වන්දිගෙවීම රුපියල් බිලියන 1.8ක් මානුෂීය හේතුන් සැලකිල්ලට ගනිමින් වන්දි ලබාදීම. Sri Lanka Insurance.
Welcome back to the news. Opposition leader Sajid Premadasa refutes and condemns claims that SJB members are to cross over to the government to obtain privileges and ministerial posts. The SJB leader claimed that such misinformation is being circulated by pro-government groups with the intention of causing harm to the party.
Issuing a statement, leader of the Samagi Jana Balawegaya, opposition leader Sajid Premadasa refutes claims that his party members are preparing to join with the current government to obtain privileges and ministerial posts. In his statement, the SJB leader claimed as fake information being circulated by pro-government groups. Premadasa said the incumbent government is pushing the country towards an abyss far worse than the previous government and that soon the failure of the government will be exposed. He went on to say that pro-government groups are ready to spend large sums to harm the Samagi Jana Balawegaya since it is the only force that can challenge the government and other forces. Premadasa added he firmly believes that Sri Lanka cannot be saved from the unfortunate fate the country is faced with without an election.
Amnesty International has called on the administration of US President Joe Biden to send a clear message to Sri Lankan President Ranil Wickremesinghe to overhaul the new anti-terrorism bill entirely or to be scrapped altogether. Its Asia Advocacy Director Caroline Nash said the silence of the Biden administration will allow the Sri Lankan government to further cement its ability to suppress dissent.
Issuing a statement, Asia Advocacy Director of Amnesty International Caroline Nash said Sri Lanka's draft Anti-Terrorism Act categorically fails on every human rights benchmark. She said if the Biden administration values the rights of the Sri Lankan people, he needs to send a clear message to President Ranil Wickremesinghe that this law must be overhauled entirely or scrapped altogether. Caroline Nash added that if the Biden administration and Congress are silent as this draft law advances, they will allow the Sri Lankan government to further cement its ability to suppress dissent. Further, she said the proposed legislation is an insult to civil society in Sri Lanka and added that this is far from a good faith effort on the part of the Sri Lankan authorities to improve or replace a bad law. It is an effort to show up the government's ability to target and silence their critics. According to Amnesty International South Asia researcher Tyagi Ruwanpathirana, the drafters of the anti-terrorism bill have not taken into account the benchmark laid out by UN experts in order to come up with a counter-terror law that would start to bring the legislation in line with international law. He said the offences in the anti-terror bill remain broad, vague and subjective and added that they are ripe for abuse.
Also in local news, the Ministry of Education announces that all government schools will reopen tomorrow as previously decided. The Education Ministry added that it will not issue letters for student admissions for immediate classes as a new circular will be issued in this regard. Accordingly, the new circular on the admission of students for intermediate classes in national schools will be effective from the 20th of this month. Sri Lanka Navy apprehended 3 suspects along with an Indian dhow that was carrying over 62 kilograms of Kerala cannabis. The arrest was made during a special search operation conducted in Sri Lankan waters off the Delve Island in Jaffna last night. According to the Navy, the recovered 23 packages of Kerala cannabis were packed in 2 sacks and it weighed about 62 kilograms and 400 grams. The gross street value of the seized stocks is believed to be over 20 million rupees. The 3 suspects, along with the stocks of Kerala cannabis and the Indian dhow, have been handed over to the Delve police by Sri Lanka Navy for further legal action. Revenue generated from expressways in Sri Lanka within yesterday alone has neared 35 million rupees. According to the Road Development Authority, the number of vehicles that utilized expressways during the 24-hour period ending 12 midnight yesterday amounted to 126,760. Director General of the Road Development Authority, LVS Virakon, pointed out that the total revenue generated during that period amounted to 34,974,100 rupees. In general, the number of vehicles using expressways total around 90,000 per day, while the total income generated per day is close to 25 million rupees. Meanwhile, the RDA Director General also mentioned that the number of road accidents that took place during the Sinhala and Tamil New Year festive season this year had reduced in comparison to the last few years. And US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says banks are likely to become more cautious and may tighten lending further in the wake of recent bank failures, while possibly negating the need for further Federal Reserve interest rate hikes. Yellen said that policy action taken to stem the systematic threat caused by failures of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank last month had caused deposit outflows to stabilize. The US Treasury Secretary added that the banks are likely to become somewhat more cautious in the current situation, adding that tightening of lending standards were seen in the banking system prior to that episode, and that there may be some more to come. And that's all from us tonight. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.